The wooden train rattled west for 8 long days from the Atlantic coast, its boxcars sealed, its human cargo listed in army paperwork as Italian female prisoners, fascist auxiliaries, 42 in total. On the morning of October 14, 1944, a little after 10 o'clock, the train finally squealed to a halt beside a strip of track in the Arizona desert, just south of a place called Florence that most of the women had never heard of. When the doors slid open, the first thing that hit them was the heat, a dry, baking wall of air that smelled of dust, creosote, and hot metal, so different from the damp, coal-scented cold of the New York holding cells they had come from. The guards of the United States Army were already in position, helmets low, rifles ready. The night before, they had sat in a dim briefing hut while a humming projector threw black and white images on a sheet, newsreel clips showing grim-faced women in fascist uniforms, captions about traitors and collaborators. The voiceover had called women like these dangerous, fanatical, willing to betray their own country for German lovers. So the men at Camp Florence expected monsters when the first Italian women climbed down from the boxcars. Instead, under the harsh desert sun, they saw how young they were: typists, radio operators, nurses, most between 19 and 30, uniforms stained with sweat, knees patched with whatever cloth they could find, faces hollowed by too many nights on hard boards. Some stared at the ground, others blinked into the light in confusion. A few still held onto a brittle defiance in the set of their jaws. Sergeant Michael Torres, 26, broad-shouldered farm boy from outside San Antonio, stood with a clipboard in one hand, checking names as each woman stepped down. When he called out Rossi, Julia, he watched the next prisoner appear in the doorway, and the rhythm of his pen simply stopped. She was taller than many of the others, dark hair matted with dust, cheekbones sharp as if hunger had carved them, but it was not her face that froze him. Beneath the dirty grey jacket, the curve of her belly was unmistakable, round and heavy, 7 months along at least. For a heartbeat, the yard seemed to go silent, only the low whine of the desert wind around the barbed wire. Torres lifted his eyes and met those of Private Danny Kaufman, the skinny New Yorker beside him, the kid who had washed out of paratrooper school when his knee gave way. Danny followed his gaze, then whispered a soft Jesus that no one else heard. This was not in the manual. The Geneva Convention said things about prisoners of war, rations, labor, mail, but there were no lines about a pregnant enemy, carrying the child of a dead German officer, standing in your custody under the flag you had sworn to defend. On paper, Julia Rossi was a collaborator from a village near Turin, a translator for the German army, flagged as a potential security risk. In front of Torres, she was also a 23-year-old woman who looked like his sisters might look if war had thrown them into the wrong uniform. She kept one hand on her stomach as she stepped onto the gravel, the other clutching a small cloth bag that held the last scraps of her old life, and her eyes moved constantly, measuring distances, counting guards, already trained to expect danger from every direction. Around them, Camp Florence lay flat under the high white sky, rows of wooden barracks with tin roofs, a mess hall that smelled faintly of burned coffee, watchtowers at the corners, with silhouettes moving behind sandbags. The entire place existed for one purpose: to keep enemies in and Americans safe. Torres swallowed, felt the dry grit on his tongue, and somewhere between orders and instinct, something shifted inside him. He leaned toward Danny and spoke quietly enough that the other guards would not hear. "Go find Captain Henderson. Tell him we have a situation." And then, after a moment that surprised even him, he added, "And tell him this woman needs to be kept away from the others for her own safety." It was a small decision, made in the glare of an Arizona morning, but it would reach much farther than any of them could see, into the heart of what they thought war was supposed to be. The processing building smelled of disinfectant, old paper and desert dust, a strange halfway point between hospital and barracks. Under the buzzing neon tubes, the Italian women were lined up by last name, their identities broken down into file cards, numbers, photographs. When Julia's turn came, she eased herself onto the wooden bench, one hand pressed into the small of her back. Lieutenant Patricia Moore, Army Nurse Corps, 32, Ohio mother of 3, stepped forward with a clipboard and the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen too much blood in too many field wards. Her gaze dropped to the bulge beneath the dirty grey jacket and, just for a heartbeat, the professional mask slipped. "How far along?" she asked slowly, choosing simple words. Her English softened in an attempt at Italian. 7 months, maybe more, Julia answered, her voice rough from thirst but steady. Moore's fingers, that had tied tourniquets in North Africa and held dying boys' hands in Sicily, now rested lightly on the taut skin, feeling for the baby's position. The heartbeat under her stethoscope was strong. The mother, malnourished, exhausted, but not yet broken beyond repair. Outside, Sergeant Torres and Private Kaufman waited in the corridor, while typewriters clacked and an overhead fan pushed the hot air around in lazy circles. When Captain Harold Henderson arrived, West Point ring glinting on his hand, expression already tightened by the mere mention of complication, Moore met him halfway with a clinical summary. Italian, 23. Fascist auxiliary. Pregnant at 7 months. Father German. Deceased. No family to claim her. Henderson had read about women like this in intelligence briefings, often reduced to a single word: collaborator. He had also read reports from British camps in North Africa, where such women, left in general barracks, had been beaten by fellow prisoners, their heads shaved, their bellies kicked in the night by those who believed they were cleansing shame. The army wanted no scandals, no martyrdoms. For a long moment he studied Julia through the doorway, sitting on the exam table with her shoulders drawn in, fingers laced protectively over her stomach, eyes fixed not on him but on the barred window, as if measuring how far it was to the outside world. "Ask her if she has anyone," he said quietly. Moore translated. Julia's answer came out in a single, flat word that needed no interpretation. "No one." Henderson exhaled through his nose, the way he did when a training exercise went off script. Regulation said one thing, reality another. "She cannot go into the general barracks," he decided aloud. "You know what will happen. We saw it with the British. Put her in the isolation building, write it up as protective custody, extra rations, proper medical oversight, and make sure the guards understand they are there to protect, not punish." Clear. Moore nodded, something like relief softening her shoulders. When Torres got the order a few minutes later, a strange tension he hadn't realized he was carrying loosened in his chest. The isolation building sat at the edge of Camp Florence, a converted storage shed with a barred window and a single steel door. By late afternoon that day, Julia was there, lying on a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a blanket, a metal chair, and a small table as her entire new world. Through the open transom she could hear the camp breathing, boots on gravel at evening roll call, shouted commands, the distant clatter from the mess hall, Italian voices rising and falling from the main barracks, a mix of laughter, arguments, and raw fury. When night dropped over the desert around 9 o'clock, the heat bled away fast, leaving a sharp cold that crept through the thin walls. Julia pulled the blanket around her shoulders and tried to steady her breathing. Somewhere outside the door, 2 male voices drifted in, low but not hostile. Torres and Kaufman, taking the first of many shared shifts, were arguing in English about whether the desert nights here got colder than in Texas, about coffee back home, about anything except the obvious. Then the topic shifted, almost shyly. "She's got only 1 blanket. You notice that," Danny muttered. "Regulations say 1 per prisoner," Torres replied automatically, then fell silent. A beat passed. "My mama would tan my hide if she knew I let a pregnant woman freeze," he added, half to himself. A few minutes later she heard the door open a crack, saw a second blanket pushed in and dropped at the foot of her bed, the guard stepping back as if afraid to cross an invisible line. It was a small, almost clumsy gesture, but it hit her harder than any shouted threat. In the British holding camp, guards had dragged women by the hair. In the streets of liberated Italian towns, women accused of sleeping with Germans had been stripped and paraded like trophies. Here, in a place ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers, the enemy on the other side of the door was arguing over how many blankets she should have. Lying there in the half-dark, listening to the crunch of boots outside and the soft jangle of a dog-tag chain when someone shifted his weight, Julia understood something terrifying and miraculous at once. These men, whose uniforms she had been taught to fear, were not preparing to hurt her. They were preparing to stand between her and the hate that was coming. For the first time in many months, the tears that rolled down her cheeks were not from despair alone, but from the shock of discovering that mercy might exist in a place built entirely for war. By the second morning in isolation, the rhythm of Camp Florence had already begun to wrap itself around Julia's life like a rough but steady blanket. At 7 o'clock, just as the first pale light slid over the Galliero Mountains and turned the barbed wire into thin lines of fire, there came a soft knock at her door, followed by Kaufmann's hesitant voice, "Breakfast, ma'am." When he carried the metal tray inside that first time, she could only stare. Scrambled eggs, 2 thick slices of toast shining with butter, a tin mug of coffee so dark and fragrant it seemed unreal, and a small glass of orange juice that glowed like liquid sun. For a woman who had spent the last year chewing boiled nettles and stale bread in a starving Italy, the sight felt almost indecent. Back in Europe, she had occasionally seen American newsreels, glossy images of housewives in aprons and fat roasts coming out of ovens, part of the wartime propaganda campaigns that archives would later file away as the mythology of the home front. She had assumed those plates were for the camera only. To see that same abundance arrive inside a prison camp, on a chipped tray set at the foot of her bed, was like accidentally walking into one of those films. Still, she did not touch it. Experience had taught her that kindness in uniform was often a prelude to cruelty. Kaufmann seemed to read the hesitation in her eyes. With an awkward half-smile he picked up the fork, scooped a mouthful of rubbery eggs and ate it in front of her. "See, no poison," he muttered, his Brooklyn accent flattening the vowels. Then he set the fork down deliberately, as if laying an offering on an altar, and stepped back a pace. "The lieutenant says you gotta eat for the baby." Something inside her cracked. Her fingers shook as she took the first bite, and the warmth and salt and fat exploded on her tongue like a memory. For a fleeting second, she was back in her mother's kitchen near Turin, before slogans and armbands, just a girl with a plate and a day ahead. After that, meals came with military precision. At noon there was stew with real chunks of beef, bread still faintly warm from the camp ovens. At 6, beans and potatoes, sometimes a spoonful of canned fruit, and once in late October when the desert wind turned knife cold at dusk, a small cup of chocolate pudding that made her eyes fill so fast, Torres pretended to look away. Little contraband extras began to appear on the tray, smuggled by guards who told themselves it was for the child. An apple tucked beside the bowl, a packet of crackers, a single wrapped hard candy. Officially, it was extra calories for a pregnant prisoner. Unofficially, it was a quiet admission that the woman behind the number was no longer just an enemy silhouette from a training film. Moore waged her own small rebellion against the brutal simplicity of war. One afternoon she arrived with a second blanket and a thin stack of confiscated Italian books, a battered copy of Dante, a volume of Petrarch's sonnets, a grammar text with notes in another prisoner's hand. "For your head as well as your body," she said briskly, "because an idle mind is bad for mothers." When Kaufmann discovered that Julia read every page hungrily, he started signing out magazines from the camp library, issues of Life and Look, full of glossy spreads about GIs in France and women rolling bandages in Ohio. In the margins of those images, Julia traced English sentences into a cheap notebook, lines like, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and I pledge allegiance to the flag," repeating them under her breath as if they were passwords that might one day open a new life. Each morning at 8, following the orders of the camp doctor, Torres or Kaufmann walked her slowly around the fenced patch of dirt outside the isolation building, one hand hovering near her elbow, the other never far from the rifle slung at his shoulder. They spoke of food and weather, of the mountains of northern Italy and the flat Texas fields, of the subway in New York that Kaufmann missed, and the church bells in Julia's village that she was afraid she would never hear again. On one of those walks, under a sky so clear it looked painted, Torres finally asked what the briefing films never mentioned. What was it like the day Italy changed sides, when yesterday's ally became today's occupier? Julia answered in halting English and fast Italian, and as her story unwound, with its confusion and radio speeches and sudden, brutal choices, the posters and newsreels that had trained them to see women like her as fanatics began to crumble in their minds. It is easy to hate a faceless figure on a flickering screen, It is much harder to hate someone who squints against the same sun, who closes her eyes in the same stunned pleasure at the taste of eggs, who walks beside you every morning with one hand on her unborn child, simply trying to keep herself and that small life alive until tomorrow, while life inside the isolation hut slowly took on a strange, fragile rhythm. On the other side of the fence, another kind of storm was building. In the main barracks, where 41 Italian women slept in double bunks and shared one long row of tin washbasins, the story of the pregnant collaborator spread faster than any official order. They had seen her arrive, hand on her belly, flanked by 2 American guards who walked a little closer than usual. To some, it looked like favoritism. To others, like proof that she was exactly what the British and partisans had called her back in Italy. The kind of woman who opened doors and beds to the occupiers. In the evenings, when the lights went out at 9:30 and only the glow of cigarettes remained, voices hissed in the dark about girls in Europe who had their heads shaved and were paraded through town squares for sleeping with Germans. Some had watched it themselves in Genoa, in Naples, in small mountain villages, crowds spitting and cheering as scissors bit into hair. Now, in the stale air of a camp in Arizona, they retold those scenes with a harsh satisfaction that left little room for mercy. Out of that anger, a leader emerged, a sharp-eyed woman named Francesca, who had once passed messages for partisans before being captured and forced into the auxiliary corps. To her, Giulia Rossi was not just another prisoner. She was a symbol of everything that had gone rotten. A girl who had chosen a German officer over her own people, who now slept alone in a private room while others crammed 16 to a hut. At first, Francesca organized only whispered debates, a kind of improvised tribunal held over laundry tubs and in corners of the yard, where women argued about guilt and honor as they scrubbed American uniforms. But soon she circulated a sheet of paper, a petition demanding that the prisoners themselves be allowed to judge Giulia, to do what the Americans, in their cold legalism, refused to do. When the document reached Captain Henderson's desk, carried by a nervous interpreter, he read it twice, jaw tightening. "This is not a village square in northern Italy," he said icily. "There will be no prisoner trials here. Geneva rules apply to all of you. Rossi is under our protection." The answer did not kill the anger. It only drove it underground, where it turned meaner. Insults began to drift toward the isolation hut whenever work details passed nearby, hissed words in Italian about traitors and German bastards. Giulia heard them all. At night she lay awake listening to the angry chorus from the main compound, knowing that if the barbed wire and American rifles vanished, those voices would be at her door. One moonless night in mid-November, just after midnight, the threat stopped being theoretical. 4 shadows detached themselves from a work shed and slipped along the fence line, moving in practiced silence. In their hands, they carried what the camp inventory would later describe as improvised weapons, a kitchen knife that had somehow not been missed at evening count, a sock heavy with stones, a shard of glass wrapped in cloth. Their plan was simple and cruel, shaped by stories they told themselves about justice. Reach the isolation building while the guards were drowsy, get inside, beat the collaborator until she bled, maybe kick the child out of her, then melt back into the barracks before dawn. They had almost reached the dark rectangle of Giulia's window when Torres, pacing his usual slow route with a flashlight and a half-carved piece of wood in his pocket, caught a flicker of movement that did not fit the pattern he knew by heart. He shouted once, a wordless alarm that cracked the stillness. Searchlights snapped on, rifles swung, boots thundered. The 4 women scattered like quail, but not before he recognized Francesca's profile in the harsh white beam. Within an hour, they were in solitary confinement, and by morning Henderson was standing in front of the assembled prisoners, his voice flat with contained fury as he promised loss of privileges and long isolation for anyone who tried again. Back in her small room, Giulia had only the sounds to go by, the sudden shouting, the pounding feet, the short, sharp orders cutting through the night. She did not see the 4 shadows, the knife, the stones, the moment they were stopped. She only knew, with a chill that started deep in her bones and wrapped itself around her unborn son, that the hate outside was real, and that without the thin line of American guards who had chosen, for reasons she still barely understood, to stand between her and her own countrywomen, That night might have been the last one either of them ever saw. The pains began just before dawn on December 18th, 1944, a faint tightening low in Julia's belly that she tried to ignore as she lay on the narrow bed listening to the camp wake up. Outside, boots crunched on frost-hardened gravel, a bugle sounded somewhere near the parade ground, and the first strip of pale light crept across the ceiling of the isolation hut. It felt, at first, like the familiar cramps of fear, the body's echo of too many nights waiting for footsteps in corridors, for doors to slam open. By mid-morning, around 10, the pain came back, sharper, wrapping around her spine and forcing her to grip the metal frame of the bed until her knuckles went white. When Moore arrived for the routine check, stethoscope already cold in her hand, she took one look at Julia's face, another at the interval between her ragged breaths, and her voice snapped into the crisp tone that had carried her through field hospitals in Tunisia and Italy. "This baby is coming today." Within minutes, Torres and Kaufman were at the door, helping Julia down the short path to the infirmary, walking on either side with a care that made the watching prisoners mutter. Every eye in Camp Florence followed them. From the main barracks windows, women pressed their faces to the glass, some with open hatred, others with a curiosity they would never admit. On the American side of the wire, guards paused in their rounds to look up, recognizing a kind of solemnity they associated with funerals and promotions, moments when the war paused to acknowledge that something larger was happening. The infirmary was a low wooden building that smelled of carbolic and boiled linens, never designed for births. Dr. Felix Feldman, a Chicago physician turned army doctor, had delivered babies in crowded city wards before the war. Now he rolled up his sleeves and turned a small back room into a makeshift delivery space, rigging extra lamps, ordering basins of hot water, like every cliché he had ever seen in a movie, and secretly hoping they would be enough. Outside the door, Torres and Kaufman waited with a restless energy they could not shake off, pacing the corridor while Henderson stood a little apart, his hands in his pockets, pretending he was only there as commanding officer. From the camp radio in the next room, news crackled of Allied pushes into Germany, casualty figures, the measured voice of an announcer listing towns no one here had ever visited. It felt absurd that the war could still be grinding forward somewhere else, while, behind the flimsy door, one woman fought to bring a child into a world that had already tried to kill him. Inside, the hours stretched. Julia rode wave after wave of pain, cursing in Italian, calling Dear's name as if his ghost might appear to steady her, clinging to Moore's hand with a grip that left bruises. Moore murmured encouragement that blurred together, fragments of prayer and instruction. "Breathe, push, you are strong, almost there." At last, as the winter sun slid down and the sky outside turned the same bruised purple as the mountains, a thin, furious cry split the air. Feldman held up a small, slippery, indignant scrap of life, checked quickly for limbs and breath, then wrapped the baby in a clean towel and placed him in Julia's arms. "Male," he announced, voice unexpectedly gentle. Strong lungs, she looked down at the tiny face, at the dark hair plastered to a damp forehead, and everything else fell away. "Dear," she whispered, naming him for the German officer who would never see his son. Outside in the corridor, Moore opened the door and gave the waiting men a tired smile. "It is a boy. Mother and baby are doing well." The reaction was strangely restrained, as if everyone understood that applause would be wrong here. Torres let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and laughed under it. Kaufman turned away to swipe a hand across his eyes, muttering something about dust. Henderson simply nodded once, then said quietly, "Make sure they have extra blankets and decent food. We will not have a child born on American soil start life hungry." In the main barracks, the news arrived as a murmur that ran from bunk to bunk. Some women spat on the floor, calling the infant a Nazi whelp, proof of shame that should have been smothered before it drew breath. Others, like Rosa, the older nurse, only stared at the ceiling in the dark and whispered a different truth. A baby is a baby, even if his father wore the wrong uniform. In that small room at the edge of the desert, as Julia cradled her son and felt his heartbeat steady beneath her hand, the war outside did not stop. But for a few hours, its logic was challenged by something it could not fully swallow, a fragile, stubborn insistence that life would continue anyway. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. But Camp Florence lived in a strange afterglow, its routine still running while the machine that had created it ground to a halt. Repatriation lists came down from headquarters, and one by one the Italian women were processed out, loaded onto trucks, then ships, bound for a homeland many no longer recognized. Julia watched from the doorway of her little hut, Dear drowsing against her shoulder, as Francesca's group climbed into the back of a transport in June. For a moment their eyes met across the yard. Francesca spat once in the dust, a gesture more tired than vicious now. And then she was gone, swallowed by a plume of exhaust and the long road east. In August, the camp felt almost hollow, its barracks half empty, its watchtowers manned more from habit than necessity. Julia remained, her paperwork trapped in the slow gears of Washington and the Red Cross. Henderson had decided months earlier that sending her back into the chaos of post-war Italy with a German officer's child would be a quiet death sentence, and he said so bluntly in his letters. When the answer finally came in October 1945, it arrived in a canvas mailbag like any other memo. He read it once at his desk, then walked straight to the isolation building himself. "You are approved for resettlement," he told her, holding out the papers. "Refugee status. Placement in New York through a Catholic agency. You and your son will be permitted to stay in the United States as legal residents." The word free felt strange on her tongue when she tried it, like a foreign sweet that she was not entirely sure she was allowed to taste. Free did not mean forgetting or erasing what had been done. It meant a chance to go on anyway. The goodbyes came quickly after that. Torres left first, orders in hand, duffel over his shoulder, bound for a farm outside San Antonio that seemed impossibly far from Arizona sand. He knelt to tap Dear gently on the nose, grinning when the baby grabbed his finger with surprising strength. "You take care of your mama, little man," he said. "And if you ever end up in Texas, you come eat my mama's tamales." Julia hugged him with a fierceness that surprised them both, feeling the hard outline of his harmonica in his breast pocket. A week later, Kaufman stood in the same doorway, cap tilted back, holding out a scrap of paper with a Brooklyn address scrawled on it. "My mother," he said. "You write if you need anything. I told her about you. She's already half adopted you in her head." He kissed Dear's forehead in a quick, embarrassed gesture, then stepped back before his voice could betray him. On the day Julia left Camp Florence, the bus that would take her to the train station idled in a haze of diesel and dust. Moore handed her a thick envelope stuffed with medical records and contact names in New York, squeezed her hand and said, "You are stronger than you think. Remember that." From the mess hall came a small paper bag of food, collected by the cooks. In her battered suitcase, wrapped in one of Dear's blankets, lay the little wooden coyote Torres had carved, its smooth surface burnished by her fingers. As the bus rolled away, Julia looked back at the receding line of barbed wire, at the squat silhouettes of the barracks and the tiny square window of the hut that had been both prison and refuge. She thought of the woman who had arrived here expecting to die, and of the one now leaving with a sleeping child in her arms and a stamped document in her pocket that said she had a future. Brooklyn, when she reached it, was noisy and grey and crowded, but it gave her what war had stolen: anonymity. With help from a Catholic charity and from Mrs. Kaufman, who treated her like a long-lost cousin, she found work in a textile factory and a room in an Italian neighborhood where no one asked about the war too closely. Dear grew up speaking English with the flat music of the city, playing stickball in alleys, learning about his parents in fragments at the kitchen table. As a man, he became a teacher, standing in front of classrooms to tell students that history was not just dates and maps, but choices made by frightened, imperfect people. He spoke of his mother in a desert camp, of American guards who decided that protecting an enemy was part of staying human, and he kept the little wooden coyote on his desk as a reminder. To most who saw it, it was just a carving. To him, it was proof that in a war built on the demand for total hatred, a handful of ordinary men and women had chosen something else. Long after the towers of Camp Florence had been torn down and the barbed wire rusted away, that choice remained, folded into the lives of the people who came after, a quiet argument against the idea that enemies are all we can ever be to one another.